Well, good evening and welcome to the virtual book launch of Finding the Peacemakers by Dan Morrice. My name's James and we are here at City Church in Bristol and it's really wonderful that you can join us as we explore this book that's been written by Dan. And this book has been a genuine adventure for him, traveling across continents and deserts, meeting former football hooligans and Syrian refugees. And the book is Dan's passion project, which is to tell stories of hope that haven't really made it into the mainstream media. And so this evening we're going to hear some of those stories that feature in the book, and as well as some footage of some of Dan's adventures over the last few years. There's also a way that you can play your part, which will probably be obvious, but we'll come to that at the end. And just to say, if you do have any questions for Dan, then you can pop it in the chat below, and we'll try and answer them at the end. But if we don't have time, Dan has kindly offered to respond to them in a blog post of some description. Dan, what an amazing day. You must be absolutely chuffed.
Yeah, thanks,
and
mate.
Delighted that the books are here, that you've got them in your hand. It's definitely the smartest I've seen you in a long time.
Maybe ever, yeah.
Maybe even ever. But what a brilliant day, a publication day for you. Why don't you just tell us at the beginning, how did you come to write this book?
Thanks, James. And to be honest, seeing this book now, this is the end of a road. So actually, when I started, this was a bit of a dream, to be honest. Like a lot of journeys, you start with just one step. And for me, a few years ago, I was a geography teacher. You were a history teacher, actually. But amazingly, we're still friends. And so,
yeah, we talk.
Yeah, I was like a lot of people. I loved hearing about different stories in the world, but I sensed that there was a little bit more negative stories, if you like, than stories of hope that I read in the media. And that's not always bad. I think it's important to sort of flag up injustices and do things about. It's good to hear the whole picture, but I just felt the balance isn't quite there. And I was really sort of hungry for stories of hope, particularly in situations where things have gone wrong. I wanted to hear about the stories of people who were changing their environment, the peacemakers, the heroes. And in situations of conflict, you often hear stories of victims and oppressors. But I've managed to I'm very pleased to have encountered people who come in the opposite spirit, who don't identify as a victim or act as an oppressor or come in revenge, but people who act as peacemakers, who listen to and learn from people who reach out to their neighbours and even their enemies. And those stories, I feel, have the power to inspire this generation. But for me, it started with just one story. So I was still teaching, and I was on a course in London, one of those rare breaks from the classroom. And it happened to be the day when the Chilean miners were freed from their sort of underground prison. It had been a story which a lot of people remember. It had been going on for 69 days. And it started as as an obvious disaster. So the mine, the segment of rock that collapsed in the heart of a mine was twice the weight of the Empire State Building. So, if you look at the sort of parameters of their survival, there was minimum water, probably 3 days emergency rations. A lot of them probably would have been crushed in the collapse. Dirty water, doubtful they've got oxygen, can't get them out. You look, the journalist would kind of piecing together the sort of facts, thinking, there's no chance. And yet, on day 17, there was that famous moment, which we'll look at in a second, when they were found. And it was from that moment, what was a story of a disaster just switched and became this beautiful story that the world was gripped by. There was this sense of, this is good news. Something good's happening. And the day that I was in London on the train, on the tube, and the London Underground is not known as a place of mass euphoria in the morning commute, but there was a tangible atmosphere of just real joy as people celebrated men who had been given up for dead, now emerging into the light, tears cutting through dirty cheeks, hugging their wives, high-fiving the president. And that sort of moment, I think, it was something in British culture, but right across the world, there was a moment when everyone was like, good things happen. And for me, it set me on a bit of a journey to find out. So a few years later, I read a biography by one of the miners, Jose Enriquez, and I looked also at the sort of main account commissioned by the miners, by Hector Tobar, Deep Down Dark. And there were stories in those books that really sort of that suggested there was a deeper level in this disaster and this rescue. And there was a sort of spiritual element to it. So I think, and the press kind of hinted at that. I think the Times called it the miracle of San Jose. And there were elements of stories that the miners shared about answered prayers and miraculously clean water and the drill deviating into the right place by itself and all these sort of stories that they shared. And I think, understandably, the press is not used to this, didn't know what to do, so kind of hinted at something remarkable, but sort of left it a bit hanging. And I spoke to people who were like, yeah, what was that? So out of curiosity, I wrote to one of the miners, Jose Enriquez. I say wrote to him. I didn't know where he lived. I didn't have his address. So I wrote to his publisher and said, could you forward this letter on to Jose? I mean, it's a long shot. I didn't hear anything. I tried to call them and nothing happened. But bless Zondervan, someone in Michigan just sent it on. Off you go. That letter disappeared into Chile's post, and it eventually landed on the doormat of Jose. And he got his daughter to email me and say, here's my cell phone. Call me when you land.
I love that. Call me when you land. Expecting you to then be there.
Yeah. I don't think he knew I was working. I was still teaching at the time, so I had to wait until for some holidays. And I recruited a friend, Louise, Glenn, and Ross Vardy to help with translation and filming. And we went out with one cell phone number to see what happens. And maybe we'll show that little clip now, because I made a little film at the end of it. So the first 5 minutes sort of capture the beginning of this adventure, if you like.
Great. Let's watch that now.
In August 2010, a strange and desperate story suddenly gripped our nation. The San Jose copper mine in Chile had collapsed, and a giant shard of rock, twice the weight of the Empire State Building, had given way in the heart of a mine, with 33 miners beneath it, buried alive, 2,300 feet underground. Initial rescue attempts proved futile. There was no sign or sound of life, and even if any of the 33 miners had, by some miracle, survived, it seemed impossible that they'd find them in a tiny room nearly half a mile down, let alone get them out without triggering a further collapse. Chile's Minister of Mines, Lawrence Goldbaum, was the first to address the families who had set up camp on the surface.
Expansión que provocó derrumbe. Esto obviamente bloquea esta entrada y esta posibilidad de entrada. Estamos con todos los equipos técnicos tratando de buscar otros mecanismos técnicos para resolver esto.
Conditions at the base of the mine were utterly inhospitable. There was constant darkness, scorching temperatures, and toxic air, yet their ventilation shafts were completely blocked, and they only had enough food and water for 3 days. There was no medicine, no contact with the world above, and no possibility of escape. The only way rescue teams could get to them was if they drilled their way down, but the mine was so vast, their efforts were largely guesswork. So after 2 weeks of failed attempts, almost everyone had given up believing that any of the miners were still alive. But after 17 days without contact, one of the drills hit an air pocket, and the engineers thought they heard someone bang on the end of it with a wrench. When they brought the drill back up, attached to the end was a small crumpled note bearing some incredible news.
Estamos bien en el refugio Los 33.
A story which initially seemed to offer no hope had become something truly amazing. My name's Dan Morrice. I'm a geography teacher in the city of Bristol, and like millions of others in Britain, I was captivated by this story as it unfolded over 69 days. Something about the rescue of these ordinary hard-working men, trapped deep in the earth, seemed to capture people's hearts right across the world. In the most televised mine rescue in history, 1 billion viewers tuned in live as one by one, those 33 men, once thought to be dead, now emerged from that deep dark pit into the light of day, and the arms of their waiting families, every one of them alive and well. What happened to transform this disaster into something so beautiful? Maybe they were all just lucky, at least that's the story I was told. But as I read the first-hand accounts from the miners themselves, they seemed to tell a different story. Many of the 33 were in no doubt that the miracle of a San Jose mine rescue really was just that, a miracle. Curious to find out more, I wrote to one of the miners, and many months later, my letter arrived on the doormat of a small house in Chile's Lake District, at the home of Jose Enriquez. He wrote back immediately and invited me over to interview him in person. So I enlisted the help of a couple of fellow teachers, Ross to translate and Louise to capture the story on film, and we set off for Chile to hear the story from the miner's perspective. Within a week, we'd travelled 1,000 kilometres from the lush green hills of the south to the San Jose mine itself in the desert plains of the Atacama. We ended up meeting not just Jose, but 3 other miners as well. We had lunch with the regional head of social services and interviewed the chaplain to the president. How a curious trio of teachers managed to get this far, I do not know. But what I do know is that the stories we uncovered from the mine were beyond anything we could have imagined. This is the account of a San Jose mine rescue from the people at the heart of it.
Como buscar una aguja en un pajar. Una galería tan chiquita de 4x4 que llegaron a una perforación a esa profundidad, 700 metros de profundidad, no era prácticamente imposible. Empecé con un dolor muy fuerte en el pecho, no podía respirar. Y yo pensé que había llegado el momento de partir.
Fui a ver a los familiares y vi sus caras de angustia, de desesperación. En ese instante el cuadro se veía muy negro. Y yo me salió del alma decirle, mire, yo no les puedo prometer nada más que los vamos a buscar como si fueran nuestros propios hijos y no vamos a escatimar ningún esfuerzo, ningún sacrificio hasta que los encontremos.
It's just a phenomenal story, isn't it, Dan? And I've watched this footage a few times recently in preparing for it, and I still get the lump in my throat when you watch it. So just an incredible story. One of the miners that we were introduced there was Omar, and he had just a remarkable story, which is in the book, and I just wondered whether you could share some of that story with us.
Yeah, well, that was one of the stories we didn't know before we left. So I was expecting to meet Jose, and he was as wonderful as I thought he'd be, an amazing guy, just a big heart, a big sort of father figure. And he's when we finished our interview with Jose, he said, "Oh, you should meet my other mates." And so he sent us up to Copiapó in the north, and there we met Omar. And Omar took us to the mine and Camp Hope, where it all happened. And he shared with us his story about in the base of the mine, he was basically in his last moments. And so, I mean, the conditions in terms of breathing were toxic. I mean, there was permanent, 100% humidity, permanently in the 30s or 40s, heat. And just, I mean, the dust was enough, but there was mold growing on the walls. It was a very pathogenic environment, and he's started to feel his chest tighten. And I mean, they looked in the refuge for sort of oxygen tanks and medicine, but there was nothing. And what do you do? You're stuck underground. You're sealed in by a block twice the weight of the Empire State Building. There's no ventilation. They're like, well, this is you, mate. And he had a real sense that was the end of his life, and he could feel himself fading away. And so a few guys gathered around him, and he prayed. And he had this moment. He said this in the interview, and you can see it in the film. He said, I just had this conviction. It wasn't my moment to die. It was my moment to fight. That was his words. So he started praying with this sudden faith that he was going to be okay. And as he prayed, this cold breeze swept up. I mean, you've got to bear in mind, it has been, for 17 days, it's been nothing but like a sauna. And so, like, where's the cold breeze come from? This cold breeze swept up over him. It restored his breathing. And then the other miners were like, where's the cold breeze coming from? So he got up, and they went looking for it. Because he basically thought, well, a drill must have broken through because there must be contact with the world above. And the cold breeze took him down into the mine, where it should be hotter. And as his breathing basically, as he completely recovered, the breeze just vanished into thin air. And no one has ever known what it was. And so he told us, I remember Ross was translating, and he just looked like, wow. And me and Louise like, what's he saying, Ross? And you always get like the second hand, you always get like a bit of a delay when you're translating. And you could see Omar smiling as Ross was translating. And that story, among others, I just thought, what is going on here? And I still don't know. And I still, with some of the miracle stories and that kind of thing, I don't quite know what to do with it. And I know lots of people have different reactions, and you can look at the more naturalistic explanations. Some people talk about, well, maybe there was a collapse and released a sort of fortuitous pocket of cold air. And I don't really want to sort of overanalyze it. I just want to hear the story and think, well, something's happening. And just kind of put it before people, like Omar said, could you do this? And see what people think.
Yeah, that's so cool. And I guess that's an example of a story that you probably wouldn't hear otherwise if you hadn't had that conversation with him.
Yeah.
you wouldn't have heard about it.
Yeah.
Perhaps people who won't read the book, they won't hear about it. But
No.
this is an opportunity to share that.
And everyone
story.
remembers the story of the Chilean miners, but people don't often hear the little narratives behind it.
Yeah,
So-
I love it. So this trip to Chile and the making of the film, The Miracle of the Mine, and you can actually watch that video, can't you, on the website?
Yep.
This started your journey in terms of finding other stories to tell, these stories of hope.
Yeah.
So tell us what happened next.
Well, yeah, a couple of things happened. So one of the things I noticed in the Chilean mine, which I hadn't expected, was the role of the sort of peacemaker, particularly in Jose, but in other miners as well. I mean, that environment really could have ended badly. So because they ran out of food, because some of the guys had helped themselves to the emergency rations a bit early, there was real potential for a bit of a fight. And you got 33 alpha males trapped in what's basically an underground sauna, fighting for the last scraps of food as they're about to die. You think that's not going to end well. But Jose stepped in, and other miners as well, and they just said, we're gonna make peace with each other. We're gonna pray to God. We're gonna forgive one another for kind of fractious moments. And when he discovered them, a lot of people said the miracle was not just that they were all well, but not they were all alive, but they were all well. Yeah. And actually, there's this sort of unified brotherhood that was like, whatever happens, we're not going to be divided. We're going to love one another. We're going to serve one another. We're going to give our last bit of cookie to the guy next to us. All those kind of things. Yeah. It was remarkable. And I wanted to capture those sort of stories of peacemakers. So I took a sabbatical from work. I naively thought I could write this book in a year to begin with, which I quickly learned it's a bit of a bigger job. So I took a break from work. And after the Chilean mine rescue, not long afterwards, the Arab Spring sort of rippled out from Tunisia across North Africa and into the Middle East. And that was actually the opposite of a Chilean mine rescue. The Chilean mine rescue started badly and ended well. But actually, the Arab Spring started as a season of real hope. Yeah. And actually, it was in Tunisia. The Tunisian authorities, the sort of quartet that managed it, were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And the people just thought, this is a wonderful thing, real democracy. It was called the Jasmine Revolution in Tunisia. But as it went east, as you know, it didn't go down so well. And some governments weren't so happy to go quietly, and there was a lot of violence. And sadly, in the international community, a lot of different views and lots of money and arms are pouring in, and lots of rebels who wanted this, that, and the other, and just so many different fractions and governments and fighting, and it just got very messy. And it became the biggest refugee crisis since World War II. And I, in the midst of all that, and people had asked me with a Chilean mine rescue, where is God when people don't get their miracle, and that kind of thing. And these are all very good questions, and I don't always have the answers, but I thought, I want to pursue the stories, not just of the happy ending ones, or about the ones where it's a complete mess. I wanted to speak to people in that situation. And particularly in the Middle East, I think particularly with some of the extreme groups like ISIS, Christians were particularly targeted. And so people fleeing from the Middle East, I wanted to know, what does your faith look like when you are suffering for your faith? So the Chilean miners, a lot of them weren't believers when when it collapsed. They started to pray as you would do when they needed to. But the government was on side, and like in Britain, there's no crime against whatever religion you choose. But for these believers in the Middle East, it really was life or death. Yeah. I can't tell all the stories, but I'll tell you one. So I had the privilege of meeting a guy called Zayn and Layla, I'll call them. That's not their real names. But I met Zayn in a coffee shop on the fringes of the Mediterranean. And he had fled from Syria. He was originally, from Iraq. He was originally Syrian. And ISIS were one village away. And he fled up into the mountains with his family. They paid a smuggler to kind of get them out. And the smuggler left them because he wanted more money and they didn't have it. And they were just abandoned in the mountains on the border of Turkey. And the snow was thick. And the way... it's something I've noticed in the Arab world. It's a very beautiful way in which people communicate. So the tragedies are very tragic, and the breakthroughs are beautiful. And he said, there's this phrase I remember him saying that my translator, Dan Green, shared with me, which was that he said the snow was up to 1 meter high, and the animals were just waiting for us to die so they could eat us. And I thought, wow, it was so intense. Oh my goodness me, what happened? And he was rounded up by the Turkish military in the end and put in this detention center. And it just got worse and worse, this story. It was a real sort of cocktail of disease. They weren't given much food. They were packed in 1,500 people in what was basically a basketball court. Yeah. 2 blankets for the family, one underneath and one on top. No one was sleeping. Everyone was just packed in, babies crying, people suffering. And then Zayn's daughter got sick, and she had a fever. he noticed that the doctor giving out medicine was just the cleaner. He was just given a bottle of medicine, didn't even know what it was, and was just giving it to every kid, same spoon. And Zane was like, this is just spreading the disease. This isn't helping. Yeah. And the guy just said, well, you don't want it. You don't have to have it. So Zane left it, but the couple next to Zane and Layla were Iranian, and they overheard the conversation. They spoke their language, and they just said to Zane, look, we're Christians. We became believers in Iran, and we had to flee. And could we pray for your daughter? And Zane had he was interested in this. I mean, he wasn't a Christian, but his wife Layla had been having dreams about Jesus since she was 14, which she didn't entirely understand, which sort of prepared her for this moment. And so he was like, you know what, I mean, it doesn't matter what anyone says. If there's a chance that your daughter could be saved, you just say, yeah, right. So he was like, hey, you carry on, do what you want. And so he said, it's an unusual phrase, he said, I could tell that she was praying in a Christian way. I'm not entirely sure what that looks like, but the lady apparently put her hand on the daughter's head and was praying. And the daughter just got better. I mean, she'd been getting steadily worse for days. And just in an hour, Zane was like, she's back to normal. So he was like, what's this?
Something's going on.
So partly there's something interesting going on there. And again, like all the other stories, it could be coincidence. People get better from a fever. I don't want to sort of force any kind of perspective. And I'm convinced something, I mean, it's got to be, if someone prays and that prayer's answered, you've got to ask the question, what's going on? Yeah. But actually, it wasn't just that sort of remarkable event. It was also the fact that the Iranian family were willing to step out to someone from a different culture, a different religion, and take a bit of a risk and say, look, this might be unpopular or dangerous or a bit politically incorrect, but I mean, we want to help. And it worked. And anyway, Zane and Layla got out. I mean, they escaped to Istanbul. They got a bribe to a guard, and their journey ended up being shipwrecked in the Mediterranean. And when they got out and they got to a country in the south of Europe, Zane went into one of the churches and just said, look, I keep on encountering people pray to Jesus, and my wife's having dreams, my daughter got healed, and I'm kind of interested to find out. And he was really shocked, because in Europe, I think he thought Europe's the Christian continent. Yeah. When he met Europeans, and it's the same in Britain, people were very like, oh, this is a personal thing, you don't talk about religion. And people were just a bit awkward and didn't know what to say. And it was actually an Arab a Christian who eventually he sat down and said, look, can you tell me? And the guy goes, oh yeah, sure, I'll tell you the story about Jesus. And he kind of unpacked what it was, and Zane had said to us he had felt very guilty about some of the things he'd done in his life and just thought that God was going to punish him. And when this guy just said, oh no, Jesus was all about forgiveness, Zane was just like, this is amazing. So him and his family threw themselves, they're like, we want to follow this Jesus guy. And actually when they got their place in Germany to resettle, Zane said, I really felt this conviction from God that I shouldn't go. I should stay in the sort of danger zone and help the next wave of refugees, just how we've been helped. And that's what he did, and that's what he was doing when we met him. Amazing. And the thing I loved about that story, there's all sorts of things which you have to work out what that means. But for me, there was a real sort of feeling of paying it forwards. Like he experienced, whatever it was, that encounter or those encounters, he experienced something that gave him real hope and real peace. And so he wanted to pay it on. He didn't want to just go and tap out and live a comfortable life somewhere. He said, I want to continue the blessing that I've received for other people.
It's an amazing story again. I mean, it's just full of amazing stories. Yeah. I'm going to say amazing story a lot this evening. And we're going to come back to that idea of paying it forward a little bit later on. But I guess, we've heard some examples of these stories of peacemakers. And I think often we can see them as things that are happening elsewhere, in Chile or in the Middle East, in Africa. These incredible stories of hope. And we often miss what is going on around us in this country. Perhaps they're not as obvious, perhaps they're more subtle. But things happening even in this city, in the city of Bristol, which has got a really rich history, hasn't it? And a heritage in that. And there's a section in the book all about community, which is a brilliant part of the book. So why don't you just tell us about that? Because that is part of your heart for this book, isn't it? Is for people to read it and understand about how they can be involved in some of this as well and see this happen in their own lives.
Yeah, 100%. So on these stories, actually came away sometimes feeling a bit like, what have I even done? Yeah. Am I, where's my faith? I've seen such amazing things, and I just thought, little old me in my house, like, what am I doing for my city? And we'd actually, as you sort of inferred, there's there's a beautiful sort of thread in Bristol's history through a guy called George Muller, one of the sort of church fathers. And Bristol's actually got quite a sad history. I mean, the city's been part of all sorts of terrible things in the slave trade, in exploitation, even within our own city. But there's been, in the midst of some of the saddest parts of Bristol's history, there's been a few sort of unsung heroes who are like, I'm coming in the opposite spirit. Abolitionists and freedom fighters who actually stand in the complete opposite spirit to what's going on around them. And one of those was George Muller. So he arrived in the Victorian era, and there was lots of orphans on the streets. And he said, I mean, who cares for these children? And the response he got from everyone was, well, no one. I mean, just kids. Yeah. And his kids whose parents had died, and they were just on the streets. So he said, well, they can come and live with me. And his wife, and they took him into part of their family, and he kept on taking in kids. And quite remarkably, I mean, you can read the story, it's extraordinary how it happened, but he ended up taking in thousands of orphans and building these homes in Bristol, which still exist today, and taking it. And if actually Charles Dickens came to visit, because there was rumours that, that it was like the workhouse in these houses, and he was like, these houses are amazing. In fact, the only criticism people levelled at George Muller was that the children were apparently educated above their station, which says a lot about the people.
Someone had said that about my teacher.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, same. But actually, his legacy and what he started actually has continued in the city, and people have kept running his homes, George Muller homes, and sort of community houses. Not to take in orphans like we used to. I mean, there's less orphans on the streets, thank God, compared to the Victorian era. But there's still people who are lost and lonely, who've come from traumatic situations, who need a bit of love for whatever reason. And we were aware of these community houses. We had friends, Greg and Claire and the Mitchells, and people we knew who were running these sort of houses. And so I mentioned this to my sister one day, who was living in London with her husband, Chris. They got a couple of kids. And we just kind of had a moment, we're like, should we have a go? So we sort of pulled our life savings with another friend, Anna, there's a farmer from Guernsey, and I went up for an auction, and it was actually in Bristol Zoo for this derelict building in the inner city.
A classic location for a house auction.
Such a weird, I literally had no idea what I was doing.
And you can have a lion included.
Yeah, exactly. The whole thing was so surreal. I was so out of my depth, and we're like, we'll just bid with the money we've got, which wasn't much. And no one else wanted it. I mean, it was quite unsurprising. It was so dilapidated. And so we got it. And, to cut a long story short, it was hard graft. We did it up and we wanted to have a bit of space to invite people in. And so we've had people living with us from different sort of backgrounds, different moments, different people who just need a bit of love for a season. And I wouldn't say we're perfect. Like, we've learned a lot. We've made mistakes. We're not like, we haven't been a blessing to everyone. And, it's living in community can be tricky. And I've learned it. I could be quite selfish at times, but actually once you get beyond all that, and once you really get to the heart of like loving one another and just reaching out and being there for one another, it's a beautiful thing. And we found, particularly in this culture, which is becoming more fragmented and more individualistic, and actually it's very easy to build your sort of customized life, you know what I mean, to have your personal playlist and your personal diet, and it's very easy to put the sort of me first. And actually we started to learn what it's like to put someone else first, and to know the mercy of someone putting me first, and really to serve one another. And like I say, we haven't always got it right, but I feel like it's been a beautiful thing, and I would recommend it to anyone. I've loved it, but I thought it'd be fun to actually hear the story rather than me tell all the stories. Fun to hear it from the point of view of someone else. So we actually had a guy who stumbled into our lives, shall we say, quite unexpectedly, called Daniel Abrahamson, and he kind of caught the vision that we'd caught from Greg and Claire and other people and continued it. So I actually caught up with him at the weekend, and we're going to share that little clip now, so you can hear his version of a story, shall we say.
Great, here it is.
So Daniel Abrahamson, or Sweden as you're known in these parts, probably less so in Sweden because it's not such a novelty over there.
That is true.
But we met in Bristol when you were busking in our city, and I could tell the story, but I thought it'd be more interesting if it came from you. You can kind of share from your perspective how you rocked up in our little neighborhood. So go for it.
Yeah. So basically I was traveling around the UK busking, so playing music on the street and trying to raise awareness about human trafficking. So I was playing music and speaking about this issue, and the first city was Bristol, and I was traveling I was going to travel for 2 months, so I felt it was a good idea to find some people, because you get lonely. So I called different churches, and City Church, they said we might have someone, and I was sitting on a park bench in Bristol, and then just waiting basically, and then you called me back and said that I could stay with you for a couple of days. So and that's what happened. And you had you had a part of the story that I didn't know, so you can maybe tell slightly more about that.
I got a call from Olivia in the church office just saying, yeah, we've got this traveling Swedish musician. And then I'm like, yes, of course. She said, could he stay with you? And so it felt a bit left field. And that particular weekend, Emma and Chris had organized a sort of, they called it DIY SOS, which I know is a TV show, but it was like different volunteers from around Bristol could come and sort of help their neighbors out with a bit of DIY, partly just for practical things, but mainly just kind of get to know people and have a bit of fun and, break down barriers between neighbors and stuff. And that was happening from our house that weekend. So there's a lot of people coming and going, getting cans of paint and gardening forks and stuff. Yeah. And we were like, maybe this isn't the weekend. So we didn't know you at the time, so we're like, is this guy safe? So and I'd spoken to you and I'm like, look, this guy seems really nice. And he's raising awareness to try and end human trafficking. Like, he's got to be a good guy. I mean, we all believed in that, and we support A21 as well, the organization to end human trafficking. So we thought, I think we've got he's a kindred spirit. Let's invite him in. And so you turned up, and then we kind of said, look, we're sorry, we've got busy this weekend doing this project. And you were like, I'll join in. And you just joined in, and you got painting our neighbor's house, and they became friends of you. And so much so, I think they liked you so much that they started calling you Dan. And I was referred to as like other Dan. And then you could let's just have a gig in our garden. And people came into our garden for the gig. You were on Facebook Live.
You are my love, and you are my friend.
Thanks so much. And the whole weekend just sort of snowballed into what started as a slightly random phone call. And then what was amazing for us is you, having seen our house and a little bit what we're doing, you then went back to Sweden and almost sort of caught the vision yourself. So maybe do you want to tell that part of the story?
So I've been thinking about kind of starting sort of a community house for a while, but I didn't really know how it would work, and I've never been in one. So when I went to your house, and I kind of I felt the openness, and I felt like this is a kind of place that I want to create as well. So I had the possibility to buy a house, and I did, and I asked some Christian friends to join, and then 6 months later, two guys that had to flee their countries and they come to Sweden. They weren't able to stay in the place they were staying from, that the government had for them. So they would have to move from the city, and all the connections that they've done with the church and people would have been lost. So they moved in, and one of them is still living in my house. Another one is living in another city, and they're both doing well. And since then, the house have been a place for people of all walks of life, of all faiths. So I'm very thankful, and I don't think I would have taken the leap if I wouldn't have come to you. I really don't think I would have. So that's
amazing. But that wasn't the last time that we met. So in keeping with our slightly that unusual first meeting, then I'd been walking through the desert for weeks and arrived in Jerusalem in Israel. And I sent you a Facebook message, I think, and said, do you want to join me in Jerusalem? And you were like, yeah, okay, yeah. I don't think I'd spoken to you for a couple of years. And then you just got a flight and turned up, and I met you on the Mount of Olives. And but it had an impact on you in different ways, obviously. So is there anything that you found on that trip that really sort of inspired you in faith, life, your journey, anything that kind of stood out to you as like a key memory?
So there's many things, but one thing that I always think of when I think about that trip was when we went to a place called the Tent of Nations. It's two brothers that own a farm, and it's I think you can explain it better, but basically it's this place where people can come and help out, and they stand for such a good message. So it's located in the Palestinian area, but they have had pressure from the government, so they had to struggle quite a lot. But in the entrance they have a sign saying, "We refuse to be enemies." And that message is so profound. So I actually wrote a song about it. It's not recorded yet, but it's stuck with me, and I'm still working on the song. It's still a really deep message in my heart, and I think that's so true. So that was a major thing, and then after that we walked for a couple of days, or felt like a lot of days, and then we came to Tel Aviv, and we met with this Jewish family that took us in. Many families took us in throughout the trip, but they was one of the most hospitable people I've ever met, and they were so welcoming, and so you really felt like we were part of the family, and they took us out to eat, and they showed us around, and so I was really blessed by meeting different people, different cultures, different faiths, and feeling this sense of openness and kindness, and I really brought that with me, and I try to be as hospitable as the people we met.
Yeah.
It's great to hear from Sweden, and there's lots in the book about community life and community living. In that interview, you casually kind of just throw in the fact that you were walking in a desert and you ended up in Jerusalem at the Mount of Olives, and there was some great footage there. And so I wonder if you could just tell us about what led you to that decision to find yourself in the desert. What was going on there?
Yeah, I'll be honest, there was many moments where I did wonder, what am I doing in this desert?
I mean, we were all wondering what you were doing, Dan, back here.
There was, I always say there's two types of adventurer. There's the Bear Grylls type, who kind of know what they're doing, and then there's the Bilbo Baggins type, who find themselves accidentally on an adventure, thinking the others are going to work out. I don't know what I'm doing in any minute, and that was my story every day. So I basically, the way it came about was there was a couple of things going on. So I'd seen all these amazing stories, and I'd wanted to sort of draw them together and kind of find the golden threads in them, if you like. Really, the common denominator was their faith in Jesus. But having grown up in quite a secular environment where we don't like to talk about religion, and having had, I've grown up with friends I know and love who are not believers, and when people ask me questions or say, this is a bit weird, I often think, yeah, I know. I feel like I totally understand. Like, I've seen these things, and I've got a real faith, but I do understand people's questions, and often when people ask me something, left field, I think, I don't know. So I've always had this desire to try and communicate what faith in Jesus looks like in a way which isn't weird or isn't religious. And really the way to do that, I thought, was to try and get back to his original life, away from politics and religion and empires, and just to think, what was it like for that young lad growing up? In fact, I was going to share this with you. I have there's a question that Dan Green, my translator, has asked me before, and I often asked it to other people, which is, who started Christianity?
Yeah, my immediate response would be Jesus or God.
Yeah, which is what I said. And Dan went, actually, which I think Carl Medeiros originally said it. He basically said, look, Jesus didn't come to start a religion. In fact, he came very much as the fulfillment of a Jewish story, and he wanted to expand that to the nations, as was always promised, to every people group, every tribe and tongue, every ethnicity, men, women, children, whatever your background, however good or bad you've been. And the Jesus movement was this beautiful, organic movement that really loved people. It was non-violent, it was peaceful, it was full of the sort of miracles that we've heard about that are happening today, and the martyrs. I mean, people laid down their lives, forgiving their enemies as they, as they were executed. And people looked on and went, these guys are incredible, like so courageous and yet so compassionate. And it was a beautiful thing for 300 years. until the Emperor Constantine went, we can make this a bit more organized and just add in wealth and power and empire and violence and fight this thing. And, you know, many people would say in the history of the last 2,000 years, that was the big disaster. We didn't need buildings and empires and institutions, and we certainly didn't need wars, you know. But when I speak to people about the Christian faith, often people's biggest issues are from Constantine onwards. They're the colonization and the Crusades and the Inquisitions. They're not the Sermon on the Mount stuff, you know, love your enemies and turn the other cheek and blessed are the peacemakers. So to try and get into that original raw figure of Jesus before, you know, European empires ruined it, I thought, why not walk in his actual footsteps? Why not go back to his first childhood memory? So a little detail in the story that often people miss at the Christmas story is that he fled. I mean, his parents took him under the age of 2 to Egypt when Herod the Great tried to, you know, to kill all the baby boys because he heard that Jesus was born. And you know the story from the wise men, but actually people don't, you know, it's just like a line in the Gospel of Matthew. He went to Egypt and went back home. But actually that is, for a small child, walking hundreds of miles through the desert, full of wild animals and bandits. How could you forget a thing like that? And actually what we know from secular sources, from Josephus, his history of the Herods and Herod Archelaus, who took over from Herod the Great, all these things that are in the Gospel of Matthew are exactly in keeping of what you'd expect. And what you'd expect today, like lots of children with their families flee in the middle of a night to escape an evil dictator. So I kind of wanted just to experience something of that. And obviously I've never fled a war zone, but I wanted to just walk the journey at least, to kind of feel what's it like to cross a desert with no real planning. There wasn't. I mean, I thought I'd planned.
And you're a geography teacher, of course.
James, it is shameful the number of rookie errors I made. So I'd done a bit of hiking as well, and mostly in Scotland. Why I went dressed for Scotland to a desert, I don't know. I had thick leather walking boots, a massive rucksack. I look back now and I think, what were you? I think I was a bit nervous about the expedition, so in my panic, made no plans. And I ran out of water and I ran into wild animals. I mean, I tell the story with full vulnerability in the book, and you will have full permission to laugh at me. But I kind of wanted to do that because for Jesus and for millions of refugees who make that journey, they don't have an expedition plan or GPS or a route. They rely on the kindness of strangers and the grace of God, and stumbling across water in the desert, which is hard to come by, I tell you. And that was my experience. I relied on the kindness of strangers. I ran into wild animals. I was scared, and I survived by prayer. Basically, and some amazing coincidences that just happened when I needed them. And if you read the book, I think people will say he was either very lucky or someone was looking after him. And you can make your own mind up.
Love that. And so where did that trip conclude then for you?
Well, halfway, I mean, Jerusalem wasn't even the conclusion. I was trying to get to Nazareth, but I stopped off in Jerusalem halfway. Actually, I'll tell you what, we've got a little clip to show. Should we pause it? Because I can keep going for hours. So maybe we'll show that little clip to capture some of a bit of a desert. Yeah. And then you get to meet Swedan and Louise and Danko and hear the next part of the story.
Love it.
Let's do that.
So 4 weeks ago, I started out on an epic journey from the border with Israel and Egypt, all the way up on many hundreds of miles of desert trails and dirt tracks bound for Nazareth in the north of Israel in the region of Galilee. And I'm here in Jerusalem, halfway through, just over halfway, just reflecting on the last few weeks of this desert trek. I think if I'd known when I started quite how challenging it would be, maybe I wouldn't have set off. I remember walking up the ridge on that first morning with the Red Sea behind me into the mountains of the Negev and just seeing ridges, dark ridges stretching out across the horizon. I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed, my feet were painful already, the backpack was heavy, and it just felt like a ridiculous journey. But really I wanted to mirror another ridiculous journey that a young family would have taken just over 2,000 years ago as refugees. So the child Jesus would have started his life as a refugee in the land of Egypt, having narrowly escaped the sword of an evil and paranoid dictator. He fled for his life. So his first journey really on his own 2 feet would have been walking from Egypt all the way up to Nazareth on desert trails and dirt tracks, and I wanted to kind of capture something of that journey. Of course, there's many differences. Jesus would have walked closer to the Mediterranean. I'm further east than him, and he would have had a lot less comfort. So I had boots and a rucksack and a phone, and so in some ways I'm a million miles from his original journey.
but I still wanted to capture something of the experience of walking through the wilderness on a similar route to him on my own 2 feet. He wouldn't have taken a car or hopped on a flight. He would have walked the whole way, and I wanted to do the same, to experience that raw stillness of the wilderness and the challenges that he would have had as well. So I was very lucky at the beginning. My first week I was joined by my Cornish brother and friend Pete Kessel, and so a week into our trip we sat down one afternoon as the sun was setting and reflected on the expedition.
I think it's just good being out here and having to think every day about where your food and water's coming from, and feeling the constant pain in your back from the rucksack and the constant pain in your shoes of your weight and your rucksack's weight and all those things, and those constant reminders of, yeah, I'm a human being.
First few days I had pretty awful blisters, and just the trials of climbing a mountain with 25 kilos on your back and your feet rubbed to shreds. And yeah, I was probably having a sense of humour failure. And it occurred to me that Jesus would have felt the same. Would he have got blisters walking for hundreds of miles through the desert in sandals or maybe even bare feet? So it's humbling to think that the Son of God, incarnate as a man, would experience the rawness, literally the rawness of blisters and pain. And for those millions of refugees who know what it's like, the physical hardship as well as the emotional trauma, God can say in Jesus, yeah, I actually know how you feel. I've been there.
And that's the thing I love about Jesus. He wasn't a super spiritual, distant man. He was a real life, flesh and blood man who got dirty, who probably got blisters, who got hungry and tired and sad and lonely and all those things. And as a follower of Jesus, we have the ability to come alongside people because he's the ultimate person who can come alongside them, because he's been through all of this and a lot worse.
So for me, one of the biggest challenges of the expedition was when Pete took off home. He had to go back to work after a week, so he caught a bus from the main road going up through the Jordan Valley north to the airport, and I kind of branched west up into the Negev mountains where the air was cooler and the views more breathtaking. But it was also more isolated, I suppose. It's difficult to describe the feeling of loneliness, wandering off into that wilderness, that lifeless sort of place. And that first evening I remember being so dark. There's no natural light, there was no background noise, it was so silent. And I started to think about that sort of loneliness. And I think for the many millions of refugees who have fled their home in the current generation, this is one of the forgotten trials that many face, is that in the kind of trauma of leaving your home, fleeing for your life, often loved ones get separated through no fault of their own. And so for me, just having a couple of days alone in the wilderness and the initial stages and feeling that isolation, that's nothing compared to the real loneliness of being separated, potentially indefinitely, from people you love. And so I wanted to do this expedition to raise money for an organisation called A21, who rescue people who have been tricked and trafficked into a world which is possibly even darker than the one they left. You can support this journey, we can support A21 through this journey. 100% of the donations may go towards A21 to those who need it most.
So Dan, you get to Jerusalem, and what happened while you were there?
Well, a few things I learned on the way. I should just say that actually that video is still on the LukeX website, so you can still sponsor the journey if you want to, if you go to lukex.org and look at the adventure section. But for me in the desert, I learned a few things. One, I realised the stories in the previous about my community, actually, when you're out in the desert by yourself, I realised how much I missed them. You miss the people you love, your friends and your family and the community around me. And they gave me actually a renewed sort of confidence in the value of these basic things of community, of love, of kindness. And when I got to Jerusalem, I saw people who were showing that, not just to people they know and love, but to people who they've been taught are their enemies. And actually I found, tragically, before I went to the land, I heard people from both sides. People have very strong opinions about Israel and Palestine, as I'm sure you're used to. And I got given the kind of bulldozed with both sides. They're very much like, this side is completely bad, and these guys are the good ones, both, in opposite sides. And actually I experienced such love from both sides. I just could not subscribe to any kind of meta-narrative that said one guy's good or evil, because I met just genuine love and Middle Eastern hospitality in every faith group and every people group. And I saw in Jerusalem, I met Sweden, as you saw in the clip, and Louise Glenn, who came to Chile with me, and our mutual friend Dan Coe. And we all went to meet a guy called Sami Awad, who's a Palestinian peacemaker. He introduced us to some of his friends. We met the Nassau family from the Tent of Nations. And all these people I met are people who have they've lost land, they've lost loved ones, they've had children or brothers or sisters killed in the conflict. And they're saying, you know what, I don't want that to continue. And they're prepared to forgive, to love their enemies, to step into their shoe. And there's all sorts of beautiful movements, the Parent Circle, Musalaha, and it's not just one group, it's Jews, Muslims, Christians, Israelis, Palestinians, who are like, we really want peace, and we will sacrifice our own desire for revenge to get it. And I came back so inspired. And really, I mean, in terms of the walk, I had to continue then up to Nazareth, which I just the Jerusalem was kind of the destination in my head, and I forgot I was actually continuing Nazareth. It's like another couple of 100 miles. So Sweden came with me, which was an absolute gift. By the time I got to Nazareth, it was that was the climax of a journey, and I was trying to think, what have I learned? How do I sum up everything? And one of the things I think I'm most captured, which is why, I mean, Finding the Peacemakers was actually my editor's idea, who's brilliant, and I'm very lucky to kind of the way it came together. And I didn't actually see it for a long time, this sort of golden thread of peacemaking. But it occurred to me that actually the peace that I'd seen in people, it wasn't just a sort of mustering up of human strength or like mind over matter or like trying to be good. You know, there's sort of things where, it's quite easy to feel peaceful if you're listening to a beautiful song or if you're on the beach or something. But when people find peace in the midst of an extreme situation that's completely alien to their circumstances and gives them that strength to look into their enemy's eyes with forgiveness, those sort of things, it's more than just human strength. And there's an interesting, a lot of people will say the definition of real peace, real shalom, it's not just an absence of human suffering or conflict, it's the presence of something. And I'd seen in all these people something spiritual, something deeper, something transcendent, something which is more than just human strength. And I really wanted to sort of lay that lay that idea before people and say, what is that? And I'm honest about, I would say that's the presence of God. I'd say that's the life of Jesus. Yeah. But I didn't want to kind of land it with too much sort of teaching, if you like, too of a firm conclusion. I kind of see my role as a witness. So I wanted to be honest, because no one likes someone who's kind of sneaking their opinion under the fence. I'm like, this is what I think. But I kind of just wanted to tell the story and see what other people think. And like I said before, there's people who will say, they're all just lucky. Or the strength is within. And there's other people who say, nah, there's something, some kind of divine strength in this. And probably lots of people in the middle like, I don't know. So I kind of wanted to share the stories in as much depth and sort of life as possible. And just see what people think, to get that movement, to get those conversations going, to kind of get those stories that aren't in the headlines into the public domain and see what people do with them.
I think I've obviously had a bit of a sneak peek, and I think you do it absolutely brilliantly. It is a fantastic book, and I think just in what you said there, that we find your hope in the book and what people will encounter as they read it.
Yeah, 100%. And I should say as well, it's my name on the book, but I was always part of a team, and so I couldn't have done a single thing without the help of people like involved in the project, like my editor, like Hodder, like Jose Enriquez, giving me the stories, like the people I've met. Yeah. There's people sort of mechanics behind it, but also just the kind strangers who met me on the road and gave me their water. And I literally couldn't have written a chapter of this by myself. And so I genuinely feel like part of a bigger movement. I was the guy that got the privilege of just writing the stories down, but actually there were people who wanted to tell the stories. There were people that might take some of the things they've learned. They might think, well, if Sweden can invite a couple of people into his house, I could too. Yeah. So I kind of feel like I'm just a link in the chain, shall we say, taking these stories into the hearts of other people.
Oh, it's brilliant. It's inspiring. It's provocative. It's there to challenge us and probably shake us up a bit in terms of how we live our lives here in this country and across the world. And I think it does it brilliantly. We're about to finish, but I wanted to share I guess, a little bit of how you can also pay it forward. So we've obviously heard some of these stories about people experiencing something themselves and then doing something about it. And in a small way, we can do the same. And so I want to encourage you to do 3 things off the back of this, which is the first one, which is the obvious one, is go and buy the book. Go and buy the book. And the best place to do that is Hodder have got a partner called Aslan Books. If you just type that into Google, you'll find it. And they are selling the book at the same price as the big book companies, but you can support local and you can find this book at Aslan Books. So check that out. The second thing in terms of paying it for, why don't you buy one for yourself and buy one for someone else too? Buy one for someone else. It's a great opportunity to share these stories of hope in a time where actually right now there isn't a lot of hope, and perhaps we're feeling a little bit more optimistic now for the rest of the year, but it's a great opportunity to put this in the hands of someone else. It's also worth saying, and Dan hasn't shared it, but I'm going to, which is that he mentioned about A21, which is a brilliant charity that works for anti-trafficking and anti-slavery across the world. And all of Dan's royalties are going to that charity. And I think that really comes out of Dan's heart of not wanting to be a business enterprise project, but rather sharing the stories of other people and showcasing Jesus through it, which is amazing and inspiring. And so I just want you to know that as well. And the third thing is, so the first thing, buy yourself a book. Secondly, buy someone else the book. And then thirdly, when it comes through your letterbox in the next couple of weeks, to share it on social media. You can share this video with people. You can share the website, but share your copy of the book. Hold it up next to your face. Take a selfie and tag Luke X Project, and it will just hopefully build some momentum, get a bit more traction out there as well. We want as many people to get hold of it and to hear about this amazing project and the work that Dan has committed the last few years to. Dan, thank you so much for sharing these stories. Amazing. Huge congratulations. And we really, I know you said this is the end of something, but we're all hoping that it's actually the beginning of something for you. That there's more to come. There's more deserts, perhaps, more desert adventures. And we're excited to see everything that continues through this. So thank you so much.
Thank you.